Welcome back. So now we're going to go into presentation 6B, and we're going to be talking about surveys and questionnaires. Take a look at your to-do list. Make sure you're reading the chapters and any assigned articles, and you're following up with the activities that are in the presentation. As always, take a look at the learning objectives on your own. And let's get to it. So let's talk about questionnaires. So questionnaires offer researchers the opportunity to provide a structured series of questions. Traditionally, questionnaires have been delivered by mail or in person, and with the rise in technology more recently, surveys are commonly administered online by sending the participant a link to the survey. Surveys can be hosted on any number of sites, so for example, SurveyMonkey, Google Docs, Typeform, Zoho Survey, Survey Gizmo, etc., etc., etc. There are lots of survey sites. Many sites offer free options. However, the free options are often limited by the number of questions, the type of survey that you can use, whether you can have skip logic. Skip logic is when someone, based on their response, might skip over a question. These free sites often also limit the downloads, so your ability to download data. So you want to keep all of that in mind when you're selecting your survey site. There are many advantages to questionnaires, including the ability to collect data from large sample sizes or large samples of people. The surveys are typically standardized, so you're asking the same question to everyone within the sample. Surveys can also provide anonymity, so people may be more willing to provide true and honest answers if they feel as though no one's going to be able to trace the data directly to them. Also, administering questionnaires is relatively economical. So if you're going to administer 100 surveys, doing it by questionnaire can be relatively economical. If a survey is going to be used for research, it generally requires that the researcher obtain informed consent. And even prior to putting together the informed consent within the survey, it requires IRB approval. And informed consent is part of, or providing information about informed consent is part of the IRB approval process. Above all, researchers must consider the risk to the participants and take appropriate measures to minimize these risks and inform participants of the risks for participating in the surveying questionnaire. There are many disadvantages to using questionnaires. Questionnaires, generally you need to have a large sample size so that you can obtain enough responses or sufficient number of responses because some of those responses may not be usable. So you have to have a sufficient number of usable responses. So you usually need a large sample size. And typically with surveys, there's a low return rate. So oftentimes we send these out and we get fewer responses to them. This can severely impact the external validity of the survey results. When self-report is involved, there's always a question of bias. There may be recall bias, so this is an issue when participants need to recall information from the past. And we often see this in dietary assessments such as food frequency questionnaires or 24-hour recalls. Other concerns with self-report include participants answering the way they feel is correct or the way they feel the administrator of the survey wants them to answer. So for example, if they're reporting about food, they may say they have eaten healthier than they really have. So they're reporting the way they feel that is a better response, not really indicating what they're doing. All right, so let's talk a little bit about survey design. Surveys must be based on research questions and guiding questions and objectives. The survey has to be grounded in something and have a guiding purpose. A hypothesis can help in developing a survey. For example, if you have a hypothesis going into the development of a survey, you know how you are going to analyze the data, or, or you're looking at how you're going to predict the survey results will come out. And using a hypothesis to guide the survey development, you are assuring that the variables and expected outcomes you hope to analyze are actually included in the survey design. Outlining the questions is an important part of the survey design. In this step, an outline of the questions that are needed are listed. You may break the survey into sections, for example, a survey that is measuring knowledge, attitude, and practices. There may be a section covering knowledge-related questions, a section covering attitude-related questions, etc. Often demographic questions are included. These questions are helpful in identifying characteristics about the participants. In fact, without demographic questions, a manuscript may be rejected under the premise that there is no information about the target population. In fact, I've actually had that happen. So I had a manuscript that was rejected because the reviewers felt without the inclusion of demographic information, there was no sense in who was the target population. It's also important to review existing instruments that are out there, so existing surveys and existing questionnaires. So you want to look for questionnaires and instruments, measurement instruments that may be useful to your research topic. And you want to make sure that the instrument, if you're using one that's already created, is deemed reliable and is valid, and it's been thoroughly tested. The testing process of surveys and questionnaires is long and daunting. So often researchers will use or adapt existing published surveys. In this way, even if the survey has not been tested, so you've modified it, and you didn't really fully test it, you can use this modified survey and compare it against the results of the actual tested survey, and you can show that the responses that you will get on your survey will be very close to those of the survey that has been tested. Finally, it's very important to pilot test your survey. So pilot test it with a group of, say, experts in your field, or even people to test it for the logistics, like make sure everything within the survey is actually working. So pilot testing allows you to confirm that the survey works the way it should, is understandable, and covers the content that needs to be covered. At minimum, it helps you confirm the face and content validity of your survey. So let's talk about administering the survey. The book talks about selecting a sample after the survey is developed. But the reality is, in my experience, the sample is often selected before the survey is developed and the survey is geared towards the population. For example, I worked on the needs assessment that was developed to gather information from early child care educators on their current knowledge, attitudes, and practices about food safety. Before we even knew exactly what the survey would include, we knew who we were sending it to. Contacting respondents is an important part of survey development. Since response rates are typically low, this part should be well planned out. Page 331 of the textbook includes the elements that should be included in a cover letter. I've also included in this week's folder a sample cover letter I've used in the past, as well as a reminder letter that I've also used. Compare the elements on page 331 with the letter and see if anything is missing, or if it compiles the elements that should be included in a survey letter. All right, so now let's talk about constructing the questions. Open-ended questions really allow participants to provide their own opinions and feelings about the topic or question. Through these types of questions, you can elicit a great deal more information and often really understand more of the motivations of the person. Open-ended questions generally need to be reviewed and coded on themes. Often software such as NVivo, which is a qualitative software analysis package, is necessary to help organize the information and help the researcher see the patterns or themes that emerge. Close-ended questions allow participants to select from several choices. So choices might be multiple choice, true, false. There might be a rating scale, which is a continuum, or participant might be asked to rank order items, so put items in order. These types of questions provide an answer, and participants are selecting the one that is correct for them. Close-ended questions are easily coded and then generally uploaded into a software package such as SAS or SPSS for descriptive statistics, so things like mean, median, mode, those types of things, or for further statistical analysis. The downside of close-ended questions is a person must select from the options presented, so it really forces someone into a response. Therefore, responses must be comprehensive and allow for all possible answers. The presentation of answers is also important. They need to be clearly presented so that the participant understands what they need to do. For example, if they are asked to answer a continuum question, so something like, on a scale of 1 to 5, uh, provide an answer, the information should be clearly understandable as to which number gives the highest and lowest value. So is 1 the highest or is 5 the highest? You need to present that information in the question. Gathering frequency and time measures is important in nutrition-related work. We often want to know how often over the course of a time period someone ate or drank something. Or we might want to know how many minutes of exercise someone does a day. These can be difficult questions for people to recall, so the potential responses need to provide the information in a way to make recall easier. For example, if we ask how many times a week someone eats dark green vegetables, this might be difficult to recall. However, if your responses include some options, it might be easier for the person to recall. So if you provide information about, say how many times per week do you eat dark green vegetables, and then you provide responses every day, 3 times per week, 1 time per week, etc., it tends to be easier to recall the information. Surveys are often used to collect a wide range of information, including sensitive information. Even information we may not consider as sensitive may indeed be sensitive to others, particularly when we're dealing with food-related questions, as food is tremendously personal. Survey questions are often subject to recall bias, and even more so when addressing sensitive issues. Sensitive questions should be phrased in a way to put the participant at ease. A short introduction to the question may help reduce the anxiety of answering the question. For example, if we use the question I just mentioned about dark green vegetables, a short intro that reads something like, "Many people do not eat dark green vegetables. How many times per week do you eat dark green vegetables? Blah, 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 blah." The intro acknowledges that people may not be doing the activity and may put the person at ease. But caution should be taken with any intro so as not to bias the participant. In fact, saying many people do not eat dark green vegetables is sort of biasing the participant to an answer. When constructing questions, do your best to reduce the burden on the participant. This means be careful in the number of questions you use, so try to combine questions. Be mindful of the time it will take for the person to complete the survey as well. So again, reduce the burden on them. By reducing the burden, you're more likely to get more response and better response. Survey scales are used to identify differences in intensity between participants, and they can be used to identify attributes such as attitude, values, or even a particular characteristic such as age or gender. Categorical scales are often used in demographic-related questions. A person is asked to select which category best describes them based on the question. These scales are then presented as frequency counts, the number of people who answer the question yes, or percentages, which would be the mean. Continuous scales provide data over a continuum. For example, although someone's blood pressure has a single answer, a discrete answer, it exists over a continuum of possible answers. Rating scales can be considered either categorical or continuous, depending on how the data is viewed. For example, a 4-point rating scale on pain can be treated as categorical, and the percentages of each response shown and used in future statistical analysis, such as chi-square, which we'll talk about later. Or it can be treated as continuous, and all categories collapse to represent an overall score, which represents a score on a continuum of possibilities. How you treat the data will determine the designation of the data as categorical or continuous. Scales can also be summative or cumulative. Summative means that it presents a total score. For example, a total score on a test including 10 questions. Or cumulative, so a cumulative score, which represents the accumulation of characteristics. So for example, self-efficacy. Well, a survey may have 25 questions, only 5 are related to self-efficacy, so the score from those 5 items would represent a cumulative score. Let's talk about some special types of scales. Likert scales can be considered summative scales, as they're generally used to develop a sum of a series of questions. Typically, a Likert scale has a series of questions to assess various components of attitudes or values. I've used Likert scales to assess attitudes based on psychosocial factors, including self-efficacy, outcome expectations, etc. Generally, more than one question is included in the scale for each of the attitudes or values being assessed. There really is no consensus on the number of options to include in a Likert scale. Some researchers like 4 options, some like 5. A 5-point Likert scale allows for a neutral option so that 2 values exist above and 2 values exist below. I tend to use a 5-point scale as I don't want to force someone into a positive or negative response if they're really ambivalent about a topic. In calculating a summative score, each option is assigned a point value, and then the point values are tallied to represent an individual score. You need to be careful in making sure that the direction of the scale is consistent. And this means that if you're asking a negative question, but want the response to represent a higher value, you may need to address this in the coding and analysis of the question. Let's see an example on the next page. So let's take a look at this survey. Can you determine which question needs to be reordered when analyzing? If you said D, you're correct. The question is asking a negative, so while you want the participant to say strongly disagree, you want them to have the maximum number of points or a higher score based on that question. So responses would need to be recorded or reordered to represent this change. Finally, when using Likert scales, or really any scale, it's important to test for inter-test consistency. This can be done through statistical analysis using tests such as Cronbach alpha. Cronbach alpha helps researchers see if questions are truly related, and if not, the question can be removed. Other types of scales include semantic differential scales, and here you offer 2 options on a continuum, good or bad, for example. And then the participant selects where on the continuum they feel based on the question. Visual analog scales are similar to semantic scales, but here generally you're measuring intensity. So these are often used to measure pain. So no pain or pain as bad as it can be. So let's talk about analysis of survey data. Close-ended questions are typically coded by giving numerical values. For multiple choices, you may give a value of 1 for all correct responses, and then all other responses would be considered incorrect and would have a value of 0. Scales may be coded with a numeric value based on the scale. So it might be 4 equals best, or 5 equals best, and 1 equals least best. Again, you want to make sure you check your scales to make sure they're all coded in the same direction. Simple descriptive statistics are often used to describe categorical data. So by descriptive statistics, we mean things like mean or frequency, median, mode, and ranges. These are all examples of descriptive statistics. It's important when presenting data that the percentage includes a qualifying number of people. So you include what the N is for that particular percentage. So for example, if you have 90% of the population saying yes, or giving the correct answer, but your population is 2 people, it allows the reader to understand a little bit more about what that percentage really represents. Cross tabulations representing the frequency of responses based on another characteristic are also popular. For example, you may be interested to know how many men or women respond to a specific question. Statistical analysis can be performed to determine if there is a statistically significant relationship between the variables. Statistical analysis includes tests such as t-tests, chi-square, regression, ANOVA, and so many of these we're going to talk about in future topics. So for our activity to wrap up this session, go ahead and find a study that's related to your topic area that uses a survey or questionnaire. Review the study and determine what type of a survey was used. This is where we're going to go ahead and end this presentation. Be sure to read the chapters and complete any assignments, read extra posted articles. And if you have any questions about anything, be sure to contact me as soon as possible. Thanks and have a great day.